In the West, are we living a cultural revolution like the one from China in order to destroy the memory and whatever remains from the past? In this video, we're going to talk about the latest fashion in the United States, and more specifically in California, Juniperophobia. There exist, or used to exist, multiple statues of Fray Junipero Serra. Some ignorant folks have pressured to tear down these statues without knowing who this friar was because, let's admit it, not one of these protesters has ever opened a history book in their life. They tear down his statue because someone told them, probably through social media, that this humble friar was genocidal. So take a look at this. You're going to learn why and how these extremists are blindly serving a higher authority. These authoritative influences are misinforming the public by executing this cultural revolution, in which a new regime will impose its rewritten history, thanks to these militant protesters who are submissive to the system. But surely there is a good reason as to why Junipero Serra is being so badly treated. He must have done something wrong. Well, let's review his biography. Fray Junipero Serra was born in 1713 in the island of Mallorca in the town of Petra. And from here, he began to cover one of the longest distances ever seen. He marched off to the port of Cadiz, embarked to Veracruz, and from there he walked 500 kilometers on foot all the way to Mexico City, turning down means of transportation. During this walk, an insect bite produced an injury that would cause him a limp that would last him the rest of his life. But even then, he didn't give up. Once arrived in the capital, he went to a nearby place called Sierra Gorda. It was here he learned the Pame language in order to evangelize the indigenous people who spoke it. For years from Mexico City, he would carry out different missions to cities that were dozens or hundreds of kilometers around, like Oaxaca or Puebla. He would always travel walking even with his limp. At this point in time, he was mostly teaching and he held a position in the Inquisition. And before anyone freaks out, let's remember that the Inquisition in America had very little activity regarding executions, and the Inquisition was prohibited from judging indigenous people. And those torture instruments and so many of those stories that are told in the amusement park museums have been proven to be fakes by so many historians. In 1767, the Jesuits are expelled by the whole Spanish Empire, just like many other European kingdoms had done, like France. With this expulsion, California is left without missionaries. Therefore, Fray Junipero took the reins of the missions, filling in the void that was left by the Jesuits. Again, Serra left walking until arriving at the port of San Blas, and from there all the way to Baja California. Afterward, he would travel to Alta California, currently the state of California in the United States. Back then, it was a territory that still hadn't been explored by the Spanish. Now, there have been many statues of him, and in the Capitol building, there is a statue of him, given that he is considered a founding father. It was Fray Junipero Serra who established the first mission in the city of Los Angeles, which would later become a town, the origins of the huge city that exists today. Among the founders of this mission, various indigenous people, along with Africans and mulattoes, these people made up half of the 44 people who founded the town. Also, Junipero founded missions that gave origin to very important cities like San Diego, San Francisco, Santa Barbara, and Monterrey. With some success, the Spanish sought to integrate all of the territories that they explored into the Spanish Empire and convert all of the inhabitants into settlers, Christians and vassals of the king, just like the Spanish people were. The expansion through North America, in fact, was the least violent. Let's remember that King Felipe II had already prohibited violent conquest, and that this was a declaration of intent for what they were trying to obtain, so that the friars would begin evangelizing with the least intervention possible from the soldiers. However, this left the friars on many occasions defenseless. Tribes that were more violent and battle-hardened, like the Comanches or the Apaches, would kill them. It's not by chance that the lethal Apache helicopter of the United States Army has been given its name. The Spanish missions, along with evangelizing, taught the indigenous to read and write. Along with various trades and occupations like the construction of adobe houses, aqueducts, irrigation canals, and methods of European craftsmanship. It should be kept in mind that most of these people were nomadic and had to learn everything from the ground up. They were unfamiliar with what can be seen as a sedentary lifestyle. Oftentimes, the Spanish are accused of having treated the indigenous as intelligently inferior. But if the Spanish had thought that they were just mindless savages, then they wouldn't have also thought that they could comprehend the Catholic religion and the Spanish language. Unfortunately, a common aspect in the missions was that it created living together tighter than the indigenous nomadic way of life. They left this nomadic way to settle in the missions, which would allow disease to expand quicker due to the ignorance of the time regarding this phenomena. These unintentional deaths have created a myth about Fray Junipero Serra, labeling him as a conquistador and another Hitler. Poor and with his limp, Junipero would have been an easy target for any indigenous person. Furthermore, given that settler societies have more resources than nomadic ones, these societies tend to increase in population. Which is why, as was experienced, there was an increase in population of these Christianized indigenous people, who later on began to get eliminated by Anglo-Saxon Protestants during the gold rush, when the Americans arrived to take the gold from these zones. Also, these missions have been criticized because the friars would correct bad behavior with whips. But let's remember that not up until very long ago, whips were inherent to any educative system of every country. On the other side, within the walls of the missions, many indigenous people were protected from attacks that were carried out by other indigenous tribes. Let's not forget that Rousseau's Eurocentric theory of the noble savage is false, and there never existed a harmonious world among tribes. Tribes would war constantly amongst each other, causing a multitude of deaths. Fray Junipero's motivation moved him to mount a mule and leave California to Mexico City for a total of 1,500 kilometers in order to obtain an audience with the viceroy and ask for the dismissal of the governor of Nueva California, Pedro Fages. He also established a Bill of Rights for the indigenous people at this point. Later, he returned to Alta California, specifically Monterrey, where he died from illness and where his tomb lays. And this is basically the summary of the super vilified Fray Junipero Serra, who was Hitler before Hitler. He never held a position of great power, nor did he yearn for it. He lived a very difficult life, traveling around for miles when he could have remained comfortably in Mallorca. Due to his achievements, Fray Junipero Serra was finally canonized recently by the Catholic Church, in the face of complaints by indigenous groups who attribute crimes to him. Crimes that no one knows where they make this stuff up. The amount of hypocrisy is astronomical. They live in a country where their army and governmental organizations violate human rights more than anyone else on the planet, more than any dictatorship. The United States has a global power capable of destroying almost every country. I wonder how many of those extremists that toppled and defaced the Junipero Serra statues voted for Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. Lords of war, who have sent the army over to kill hundreds if not thousands, including Africans as dark as George Floyd. When a United States president orders the death of Syrians and Lebanese people, none of these same extremists go to the Democratic headquarters and destroy them, right? The insanity that some United States citizens get carried away with when toppling over the statue of a poor friar while they have within their borders death industries will, for a long time, be a mystery. Because let's not forget that the U.S. has, excused as a combat against terrorism, a concentration camp in Guantanamo with a bunch of prisoners who have never been judged for their supposed crimes. Let's not get started on the torture camps that have been established in other countries like in Iraq, where they tortured hundreds of men, paying that would give Nazi Germany a run for its money. But those lives don't matter for these extremists, who are too busy doing social justice to a humble friar. The hypocrisy has come to this, that Stanford University has removed Junipero Serra's name as to not offend indigenous people? But how? Since Leland Stanford, founder of this university, in fact, cooperated in indigenous genocide during his political career in California. It is as if you were to tell me that Adolf Hitler University has taken down statues of King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabel of Castile as not to offend Jewish people. In fact, Hitler's extermination was inspired by what Anglo-Saxon Protestant whites did to the indigenous people, as was the case of the famous 7th Cavalry Regiment that should be called the 7th Cavalry of Genocide.
Tiene mucha gracia que vayan a cortarle la cabeza a Fray Junípero.
It's very ironic that they cut off Fray Junipero Serra's head and not the heads of the military men who are still honored for the killings from Wounded Knee, for example. They received medals from Congress for perpetrated killings of defenseless, unarmed Indian populations, and no one has asked that these medals be revoked. However, they cut off Junipero's head, and he never ever killed anybody in his entire life. What is happening in California? It's a memory of a genocide. And there was one. This is a concrete case. It's true. There was one. The indigenous population in California. The indigenous population in California disappeared in less than 50 years in the 19th century. Why did the indigenous population in California really disappear? They were extinguished in 50 years during the gold rush. After the incorporation, I repeat, after California's incorporation to the United States. Those who partook in exterminating were those like Fremont. He has streets, he has plazas, he even has a city named after him. And I'm sure no one is going to ask that his name gets removed from the street, from the plaza, from the institutions, or from the city. Directly responsible of something that happened not that long ago, in the second half of the 19th century. The same hypocrisy happens in Hispanoamerica, where statues of Spanish conquistadores are toppled, but not statues of despicable people like Lord Cochrane, who was one of the biggest looters in the history of America. He took all of the silver reserves from the Real Hacienda of Peru. It's as if someone were to go straight to the bank headquarters and take everything.
And Chile still remembers him through monuments and streets.
Donde hace pocos instantes, con una cuerda y con la ayuda de varios de los manifestantes,
Homage for the thief Cochrane, while the founder Pedro Valdivia falls. Of course, you will not see any Simón Bolívar statues get toppled down, after being one of the biggest murderers and racists in America's history. Also, the first dictator of the continent. Neither will you see indigenous conquistadores because in Hispanoamerica, the statues that are taken down are the Spanish ones. In this cultural revolution, coherency and truth are non-existent, as was the case of the total ploy of the dead children in the Catholic schools. In Canada, it was said there were bodies found when they hadn't even excavated the terrain. The damage is already done. This lie is now stuck in popular imagination. But well, that's how these extremists are. They tear down statues of people who contributed great things, like our very own Miguel Cervantes. Then they go home and play war video games whose families are still weeping over their dead. They also vote for their presidents who have killed more than all of the Spanish conquistadores put together. Stop waiting on them. Intelligence and coherence is dimming within them. And worst of it all is that these ideas are exported and we import these ideas. And just like that, we create extremists within our own borders, just as mindless as those who vandalize statues of Rey Junipero Serra.
Indígenas le llamaban el Padre Viejo.
The indigenous used to call Junipero El Padre Viejo, the old father. And when he was on his deathbed, in transit afterward, the indigenous began to take little pieces of his clothes. They wanted to cut a little bit of his hair, and they had to separate them from his body because they wept so much. They celebrated a great funeral, great masses, and the indigenous people cried for him a lot. He is buried there. Jerónimo was an Apache of the Bedonkin tribe. He was baptized in Arizpe.
Jerónimo Chagori.
Alfonso Borrego, direct descendant of Geronimo, committee member of the Historical Landmarks Commission in El Paso, Texas, historian of the Cultural Society of Spain in El Paso, Texas. You have
Voy a tener que ver, a ver qué pasó. So yo comencé a ir a diferentes
to see what happened. I began to go to different tribes of my ancestors, who are the Chiricahua Apache. Don't get scared. We aren't so fierce like that. At least not anymore. The Chiricahua Apache were the worst. They killed everyone. It's our family, Jerónimo's family.
La familia de nosotros es los de Jerónimo. Y fui con ellos primero. Me senté con unos mayores.
And I went with them first. I sat down with some of the elders and I asked, hey, what atrocities did the Spanish commit against us? They said, ooh, no.
Hijo, no. Pero no me dieron ni una.
But they didn't even tell me one. Nothing. Not even a dispute. So I went to other Apaches, los mezcaleros, and I sat with two others like I did before, and they said, oh no. And again, not one atrocity.
También y, oh sí, no, 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 qué bárbaro. Ni una atrocidad, ni una. Entonces me fui con
Then I went to another tribe in the north, los Icara Apache, and I went with a good friend, a cacique, who I have known for many years, and I asked, hey, Brian, what can you tell me about the Spanish? What did they do to you guys? Well, no, he tells me. The only thing I remember my grandparents telling me was that they made us pay a lot of taxes, but not one atrocity. I'm looking for bodies, my friend.
Abuelos que nos hicieron pagar muchos impuestos. Dije, una atrocidad, de seguro. Pero no lo que yo ando buscando cuerpos, amigo. Y vienen.
They come to tear down Oñate's statue. Meanwhile, Don Juan de Oñate's wife, Isabela, was the great-granddaughter of Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor. That's the guy who hates Indians? Nah, they ain't doing very well.
El que odia a los indios. No, andan mal. Y no dicen, ¿tú crees que lo dicen en la escuela? Nada.